Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports, and in today's video we're going to be covering a player who is headed toward restricted free agency, which is always a fun little game to play where a team that has him wants to keep him but for the right price, and a bunch of teams have to figure out the cost to maybe pull him away from said team. And today's video is going to focus specifically on Collin Sexton, who has even more circumstances surrounding him that we usually do not see for a coveted player heading into restricted free agency. I'm really excited to cover this video today. Collin Sexton, a fun young player who I think is going to have a pretty strong market this offseason, which kind of goes against the mainstream thought here. I don't think a lot of people are really looking at Collin Sexton as a big free agent this offseason. I think his free agency is in fact one of the most important and one of the most intriguing for myself personally. And I think it'll really designate kind of what the guard market looks like going forward into the future and also this offseason. If you guys are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. And now let's jump into it. Don't forget to leave a like as well. The video preview today, we're going to talk about Collin Sexton's current situation, what his situation is like right now, his free agency details, exactly what we could expect to see him get in free agency, and also everything surrounding his current contract status with the Cavaliers. Then we'll look at the Cleveland Cavaliers themselves. Does it make sense to want to keep Collin Sexton? Does it make sense to let him walk in free agency? Do they try and execute a sign and trade to help this team win now? Cleveland, they're in a really weird spot with this, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more later on in this video. Then we'll look at potential suitors who could maybe want to pull Sexton away from Cleveland. And I have about 20% of the league in this video. Cleveland is one of those 6 teams, but the other 5 definitely have some interest in Sexton. Then is a sign and trade possibly going to be the way that Sexton gets moved? I do have one sign and trade in this video, and I think it's an interesting one to look at. I came up with it myself. I've not seen this anywhere, but I think it's actually a win-win for both sides. Then my actual prediction, where do I think Sexton signs this offseason? Will it stay in Cleveland? Will Sexton remain a Cavalier, or does a team go out and bring him in on a multi-year contract? We'll look at all of the potential outcomes in this video. So now jumping into it here, Sexton's situation. He tore his left meniscus back in November while playing against the New York Knicks, and that was a devastating injury. This year he had kind of started out really slow. You look at that three-point percentage specifically, only shooting about 24% from 3. That was only through 11 games, and that is not indicative of what he is as a player. Specifically as a shooter, he shot the ball way better than that in his career, and he's a much better offensive player even than 16 points a game really identifies. But there's a lot of different things that happened this year in Cleveland. You had the introduction of Evan Mobley, who's an all-world type talent who can maybe change the outlook of this Cavaliers team forever. You added Jared Allen, who's starting to take a bigger role there in Cleveland, and we saw how impactful he was an all-star this year. Then, of course, Darius Garland as well stepped up his play, and all of these things did factor into Sexton's early season struggles. But I think the biggest thing there as well, it was just 11 games. In 11 games, any player can slump a little bit, and their numbers can look pretty bad. And I think that was the case here for Sexton. His numbers just were not holding up to what we really expect of this kid. And I think he's a better player than really his numbers do indicate here on the screen. So let's look at Sexton's free agency. He's a restricted free agent. And for those of you, I'm sure most of you do know what a restricted free agent means. Some of you might not. He has about a cap hold of around $19.1 million, just a hair under $19.1 million. And that's a big deal. That really kind of limits what Cleveland can do this offseason while Sexton is still out there in free agency. And they have matching rights to any offer sheet. So say a team wants to sign Collin Sexton, they have to give him an amount of money that Cleveland would not themselves really be willing to offer. A few years ago, this happened with Zach LaVine when he signed an offer sheet with the Sacramento Kings of all teams. And Chicago, they had 3 days to match. They really went through their options, thought it through, and decided to match the contract that the Sacramento Kings gave to LaVine, which was 4 years, $72 million back then. $18 million a year for LaVine seemed to be an expensive price. And in fact, Chicago got ripped a little bit for matching that contract sheet. We know how well LaVine has played since then, though. It was a really good move for them. And could Sexton be in the same spot right now where a team wants to get him and maybe they offer him something along the lines of 4 years, 72? I think those two situations are actually really similar. LaVine didn't do a lot of winning. early in his time with Chicago. And so far, Sexton really hasn't been a part of winning, even though Cleveland was much better this year. Most of that success came after Collin Sexton's injury, which is so crazy because he's a very good young player, but maybe the role in Cleveland isn't quite what it's supposed to be. You look at a 23-year-old here, it's hard to find a 23-year-old who's capable of putting up over 20 points a game, and he's done that before. The year before last, when he got injured, the year right before he got injured, 24 points a game, over 3 rebounds, over 4 assists, and look at the shooting splits. A guard shooting 47 and 37 from the field and from 3 respectively, with a very nice free throw percentage on top of it. It's hard to find a player like Collin Sexton that you can easily just add to your roster via free agency, who, by the way, is only 23 years old and probably has his whole prime ahead of him, assuming he comes back from that meniscus tear A-OK, which I think he would. There's no reason he won't. He's had requisite amount of time to rest and rehab and recover. And I think now at this point, you're looking at a player who is primed to have a decent market ahead of him, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But again, Cleveland has matching rights here on Collin Sexton. So if a team signs him, Cleveland can say, no, we're going to hold on to him. We're going to keep him. But that situation itself is a little murky because you look at the Cavaliers' outlook with regard to Sexton specifically. Darius Garland emerged this year. Darius Garland, in the absence of Collin Sexton, stepped up his play immensely and became a player that Cleveland wants to build around long-term. They look at him as their long-term starting point guard, and I can't blame him for that. Garland has deserved that role. So does this mean the end is near for everyone's favorite backcourt, the backcourt in Cleveland there, Sexland? I think it very well could be, because you look at Cleveland also making the move for LeVert, where they still owe a first-round pick in that deal. They also gave up the Rockets second-rounder, which is pick 31 this year. They gave up a lot for LeVert, and there's also rumors circulating that they could give 4 years, $80 million-ish to Caris LeVert, which I think is a ridiculous amount of money. I do not think Caris LeVert is worth $20 million a year, but I could see Cleveland giving it to him based on what they traded to go get him. This team still needs some wings as well. Yes, I know a lot of Cavs fans like Cedi Osman, and I know that Cavs fans like Isaac Okoro have looked at his three-point progression a little bit and say, okay, maybe these are our wings. I still think they need to upgrade a bit, especially with how good they were this past year without consistent wing play. If you add in another talented wing here, Cleveland could become really scary really quickly, especially in the East when you need to have wings who can deal with Giannis and Tatum and Kevin Durant, Jimmy Butler. All the best wings are seemingly in the East. Obviously, that's not true, but it just feels that way, right? When you go into the playoffs, you're going to have wings to deal with these guys. And I still do think that this team needs another ball handler as well, which is maybe where you'd say, okay, well, that could be Sexton. Do you want that to be Sexton, though? That's the question, because for me, when Ricky Rubio was healthy there in Cleveland, even before LeVert arrived, I think he looked phenomenal. And it's not because Ricky Rubio is a phenomenal player, but it's because he's a smart player who's a veteran who could lead this younger Cavs team and just plays the game within himself, knows what he's good at, and that's running an NBA offense. And I think a player like that maybe fits a little bit easier next to a Garland and next to a Mobley and next to a Jared Allen than, say, a Sexton does. Even though Sexton's a better player than Ricky Rubio, I'm not sure if he's the better player for Cleveland's long-term outlook. And then do you want to reintroduce Sexton as a six-man? Because with how good this team was, do you throw Sexton back in? What if the team starts, say, 2-4 or 3-6? And all of a sudden you're looking at yourself and saying, wow, we were kind of better last year when Sexton was not on the floor. That kind of creates a lot of drama. There's a lot of iffy situations going on if you enter that mode where you bring him back, reintroduce him back into the starting lineup. Maybe Garland's not playing as well. And you get into a situation where everyone's kind of pointing the finger at each other, and the whole locker room probably would kind of subconsciously think it's Collin Sexton's fault, even though it probably wouldn't even be his fault. You have that personal issue there where you're dealing with the humanity of basketball, where you have to manage egos, you have to manage personalities, and you also just have the human element of, wow, we're struggling right now, everyone's getting frustrated, and starting 3-6 in Cleveland would be a massive frustration point. I really believe it, because this team wants to build. They want to hit the postseason next year. They want to go deep in the postseason down the road, and starting out really poorly, I think, would put a bad taste in the mouths of other Cavs, not only fans, but also players. So then let's look at potential suitors, and Cleveland's still number one here. I think Cleveland would like to keep him around, and there's a few reasons why I still believe that, even though some of the negatives I mentioned about Collin Sexton First of all, this is, again, just a 23-year-old kid who has scored over 24 points a game on efficient shooting in his career. Not a lot of players like that are around in the league. That's just simply the truth. And Collin Sexton is still someone who I think would hold trade value if Cleveland could find a way to either use that trade value via sign and trade. That's a potential outcome like we talked about. Or maybe they could look at trading him down the road. I think either are legitimate options. And I think Cleveland, the last thing they want to do is let Sexton walk in free agency and get nothing out of it. Because again, this is a former top 10 pick, someone they really liked. They thought him and Garland together were going to be the backcourt of the future. They end up moving up in the lottery, get Evan Mobley. Everything kind of changes a little bit. And Cleveland finds themselves in a spot where maybe Sexton's a little bit more replaceable than maybe they were planning, but it doesn't mean they want to do that and lose him for nothing. Then we go into suitor number 2 here, and it's the New York Knicks. Obviously, you have to include the Knicks in any type of suitor video for a point guard. And Sexton, even though he's not a true point guard, maybe he's kind of more of a combo guard at heart. The Knicks offensively would just be way better with this kid on their team. There is no denying that. Collin Sexton would be their best guard on day one, assuming you count Barrett as a forward like I do. He would be their best guard immediately. And I know Knicks fans are probably like, "Whoa, Emmanuel Quickley." Yes, I get Quickley's solid guard. Sexton is a better guard than Emmanuel Quickley. He just is. And for me, with Sexton, I think he does make some sense in terms of his ability to get to the rack. He also shoots the 3-ball better than I think a lot of people assume when you just look at him and what he was coming out of Alabama. He's certainly improved his 3-point shooting in his time in the league. And I think also he kind of fits what Thibodeau would want to do defensively. Now, I think Sexton is a shaky defender sometimes, but he's got some of the little moldable things that you'd like. I think he's a good athlete. He's fast, quick, can beat guys to the spot. He just needs to get coached up a little bit. I think utilize him maybe a little bit differently with where you're using him to guard. But I think for the most part, part of that is because he's been a young point guard. Young point guards tend to really struggle defensively anyway. And I think Sexton, when you look at his actual physical profile, not that he's super big, but I think the fact that he's got a decent athletic profile would make him at least a solid defender, especially with the system that Tom Thibodeau runs with a good amount of rim protection, usually on the back end. Of course, Mitchell Robinson's headed toward free agency, so maybe we'll see a little bit of changing of the guard there as well. But I think Sexton still is a fit into New York if they don't get Jalen Brunson. Then suitor number 3, the Miami Heat. And I know people are like, what? How do you have Miami as a suitor here? Their cap space is so broken. They signed Kyle Lowry. I'm telling you right now, the best capologists in the NBA work for the Miami Heat. When they signed Jimmy Butler, they were about negative $50 million in cap space. And they found a way to move him into their cap table by only moving Josh Richardson out in another deal with another team. Miami does a great job working around things. And Kyle Lowry, there's a lot of drama right now. He tested in over the body fat percentage that Miami Heat like to have their players under. And we saw how much he struggled in the postseason. He was not around the team a ton during the year because of some personal reasons and also some injuries. Miami, I think, is sneakily in the point guard market more than people would expect. They might say, oh, they have Gabe Vincent. Okay, Collin Sexton, again, is just better than Gabe Vincent. And if you're Miami and you're trying to compete for a championship because they were that close to making it, any tiny upgrade can help get you there. And I think Sexton is a big upgrade, again, for this Miami Heat team. I think long-term he makes way more sense than Kyle Lowry, even though Lowry, the identity, the defensive integrity that he holds definitely is better on that end of the floor than Sexton, specifically come playoff time. But I think Miami's just missing that offensive punch, and I think Sexton could provide that for a team while not being maybe as much of a net defensive negative as we've seen from Duncan Robinson or other guys who've lost playoff minutes under Spoelstra. Then we go into suitor number 4, and I've got the Detroit Pistons here. Again, this one I think is a long shot. I don't think the Pistons are going to explore this one too much, but you're going to see here there's a lot of overlap between the Sexton suitors and the Jalen Brunson suitors. I think Sexton's free agency is going to play out a little bit slower. I would be shocked if he signs an offer sheet on day one, just given the fact he's coming off of an injury. And some of the other guards available, like Zach LaVine, again in free agency this year, and Jalen Brunson, I think those two players will both hold priority to a lot of teams over Collin Sexton, just given their unrestricted status. They're both healthy and realistically had really great seasons, both of them did. So Collin Sexton here, coming off the injury, a little bit slower market, but I still think there's going to be a lot of interest around the league. And Detroit, say they don't get Brunson, and say, you know, Zach LaVine won't go to Detroit. I'm very confident in that. If they're like, hey, we have a lot of money here, we kind of want to start competing a little bit more, I think you could say Sexton's a pretty good fit next to Cade. Maybe it's not an ideal fit, but it's good enough that Detroit gets better. And I think that's a real big thing. And it also opens up their draft flexibility. If they did sign Collin Sexton, I think that you could look either guard or forward still. But if you don't sign Collin Sexton, I think, or the idea here at least, that you maybe feel like you can get Collin Sexton or Jalen Brunson. Obviously, the draft occurs first. But say they don't draft Jaden Ivey or a Shaedon Sharpe on draft night, and you go into the offseason with a bit, or go into free agency, with a big need at guard. Maybe they feel, hey, this is maybe one of our last times to have serious cap space here. Jeremy Grant's headed toward free agency next year. If we want to extend him, that'll take up a decent amount of our cap space again. Maybe Sexton's the guy we want to go with here. He's young, fits the timeline with Cade, fits the timeline with Saddiq Bey, fits the timeline with the new rookie we just drafted 5th overall. I think it could make some sense for Detroit still, even though, again, I think this is a later down the road and probably not first or second day of free agency type signing. Suitor 5, another example here of that. Indiana, maybe they're going to go after some other players in free agency, play it slow, see what they can add. Maybe they'll look to add some depth first. Maybe if they miss out on some guys, Collin Sexton's where they'd eventually land on. The one thing I have to say about this, it makes more sense from their GM's perspective to land Sexton than it does from Rick Carlisle's perspective. And it comes down to how much of a role he has in the decision-making in that front office, because I do not think Rick Carlisle would want Collin Sexton. To me, as someone who is a Mavericks fan, watched Rick Carlisle coach for over a decade, Collin Sexton just does not strike me as a player who realistically Carlisle would want to have. We've seen Carlisle have issues with other guards in the past, specifically guys like Rajon Rondo, Dennis Smith Jr., and the list goes on. There's a ton of players I'm not naming right now. You could even look at some bigger bigs like Salah Mejri, so on. Rick Carlisle has a bad history with certain players, and I think Sexton would probably find himself on the negative side of that as well. Not really any specific reason why. It just feels that way to me, which maybe I could be misled here. Maybe Indiana would love him and maybe Carlisle would love him. But just my feel, knowing Carlisle as much as I do, I don't think that this is a really good fit, but I could see Indiana kind of sniffing around at this a little bit. Specifically, again, the front office there and the GM. I think Pritchard probably looks into this a little bit more than Carlisle would like. And then suitor 6, Washington here. This is my final suitor in the video. And for the Wizards, I think this does make some sense here for their perspective, because when you're looking at a move for Collin Sexton, they tried this last year with Spencer Dinwiddie, who's a little bit older. This fits their timeline as well, but in a different way. Yes, they have Beal, but with some of Beal's rumors coming out, maybe Beal's going to look into free agency a little bit more than everyone's expected. And if he does, you replace him with the Collin Sexton move. And I think you could be not happy about it because Sexton's a much worse player than Beal, but it's probably one of the better ways to recover. But let's say Beal stays even, and you still have Kristaps, you still have Kyle Kuzma. You're feeling pretty good about that trio, and you still want to find your point guard. And again, maybe Sexton's not the true point guard, but you go with 2 combo guards. Beal can have the ball in his hands, Sexton can as well. You have 2 dynamic shot creators off the bounce who can both score on all 3 levels. That sounds like a pretty good duo to me when you have Kristaps and Kuzma as well in your front court. Daniel Gafford's here as well as a rim protector yet. Washington's got some nice pieces for sure. So if you want to try and make a move for Sexton, maybe this is your sign and trade package to do it. And I think it works out really well for both sides. And I think Cleveland would actually love for something like this to come to fruition for them. This addresses all of their needs. And this is where that $19 million cap hold is really important, specifically for Cleveland's perspective here, because you can actually trade that even before free agency starts. After the draft or on draft night, they could trade Collin Sexton's rights. They could trade the rights to re-sign him and the rights to match offers to Washington. And Washington could then say, okay, well, we have the rights now to Sexton. Essentially, Sexton will be on our roster next year because we will match any contract for him, basically. And now here at this spot, Cleveland could say, okay, that's great. We'll take back Ish Smith. There's our veteran point guard off the bench who can handle, get downhill a little bit. I think Ish Smith's a very underrated player in the league. I really do. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, I think that a lot of teams have interest in a guy like KCP, who is a 2-way guard, can guard other point guards, and can also knock down open shots when you're giving him open looks, which I think would be valuable there in Cleveland around Garland, around Mobley, around Allen. and he's got some playoff pedigree to him. He's played in a ton of playoff games in his career, most notably with the Los Angeles Lakers, and he's played fairly well in the postseason setting. You look at Corey Kispert, who was the 15th overall pick just a year ago. This is really your incentive here for Cleveland to make this deal go. Yes, KCP helps you now. Yes, Ish Smith helps you now. But Kispert also helps you now, but fits your timeline. He fills a much needed area for this team, which is movement shooting. They need someone who not only can catch and shoot, but you can run offensive sets for. We didn't get to see a ton of that for Kispert in Washington this past year. And I think a big reason why is Washington's got a bunch of good players right now, especially at that wing spot. When you look at Denny Avdia, you look at Rui Hachimura, Kyle Kuzma. When Washington's healthy, Kispert's role is limited because of how talented they are with other players on that roster. And I think here in Cleveland, Kispert could maybe become the starter. Maybe not right away. I think Markkanen's probably got that held down for now, but down the road, he could become that for them, especially depending on how that big lineup translates into next year when teams have a little bit more scouting on them and maybe find certain ways to work around that bigger lineup. But here, Kispert, again, even if you bring him off the bench, I think the movement shooting element is really important. You run him off of pin down screens. You can run some horns action with your guards there with Garland, and maybe use Kispert as a screen and pop guy, which he hasn't really been utilized as much in Washington up to this point. There's different ways to involve him in the game that I think could be really fun and really dynamic for Cleveland. And then you also get pick 56 this year. Again, just a small incentive. Usually the team that is on the receiving end of a sign and trade doesn't get a ton. And this is why maybe trading him before the actual sign and trade would occur makes sense. But here, Washington, I don't feel like Washington's going to really miss a lot of what they're giving up, but Cleveland would love to get this, which I think is why this deal makes so much sense, because Washington's got so much depth already on this roster. Sexton is, I think, the best player in this deal. However, I think Kispert, KCP, both quality players, and I think Ish Smith, again, an underrated backup point guard in this league that can have some value for a team looking to win. So then let's go into my actual prediction. And I think right now Sexton does stay in Cleveland. I think he probably signs an offer sheet somewhere else. And I think Cleveland thinks really long and hard. They use the entire time they can to consider whether or not they want to match that offer sheet. And then they say, okay, if we don't match it, we lose him for nothing, or maybe we have to try and facilitate a sign and trade that maybe isn't super advantageous for us. Or we could just match and try and figure it out later. And I think that's really the route that they go. Think about when the Golden State Warriors brought back D'Angelo Russell in the Kevin Durant sign and trade, and people didn't understand why they did that. That trade allowed them to make a move for Andrew Wiggins and the pick that became Jonathan Kuminga. Obviously, there was no guarantee you'd have that, but fairly likely with trading a guard who has been successful in his career in D'Angelo Russell, you're going to net something back that's positive, and you can use that to reshape your roster a little bit. And I think here, this is why Cleveland would want to keep Sexton, because ultimately, even if they decide it's not a fit, he's a trade chip, and you can try and bring back other assets. So that's my final prediction here. However, I'm shaky on it. If the money's right, maybe they say, yeah, that's a little bit too much. We don't think that contract's going to age super well. Maybe we're out on it. And it's going to come down to their team doctors as well. So again, this is my prediction. I could be extremely wrong on it, which is why I would love to hear your guys' predictions in the comment section. If you're still watching at this point, comment Sexton with an arrow to whichever team you think he'll be there, whichever team he'll sign with. If you're still watching up to this point, fill in the blank again with your projected landing spot. Like, subscribe to the channel. Check us out on Twitter. Links in the description as well to that. Got some really exciting stuff coming up on the channel. I'm so stoked for what's coming in the future here at Utility Sports. Thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully you did enjoy today's video. Again, if you did, leave a like, subscribe, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.